Welcome everyone to another edition of the Subseasonal Forecast Contest. We're here. We have a special guest today. Matt Lanza joins us. We're gonna turn it over to Matt here in just a few minutes. Today is August 4th, so our 16 to 20 day window is August 19th to the 23rd. We're still forecasting CDDs. And before we get going here, I just wanted to bring attention to a new input that we have in the weekly table. Yeah, you can see it down here. So historically, we've had the persistence inputs. We've ran performance metrics on them, but we did not include them in the weekly forecast table. So as of this week, we're doing it. Obviously this is our first week kind of testing it. So if anyone sees any unusual behavior, please let us know. Please let me know, or Zach know. But in general, the way it works, just as reminders, we've got 5 persistence inputs ranging from based on the last 5 days versus the last 45 days. And so what this means is, for example, the persist 5 days, it looks at the conditions, specifically either CDDs in the summer or HDDs in the winter. So it looks at, in this case, the CDDs from the most recent 5 days of verification. So those are the 5 days ending yesterday. So what's yesterday? August 3rd. So the 5 days verifying August 3rd. And it basically uses that anomaly or standardized anomaly from the 30-year normal and applies that to the 16 to 20 day forecast. So that's effectively how it works. And I emphasize standardized anomaly because we're looking 16 and 20 days in the future, especially when you get to the ends of the season. A 5-degree anomaly in August may not have the same standardized index as a 5-degree anomaly in September. So we do standardize it to try to account for the change in the season. But anyway, just to look at these today's forecast, I think probably what stands out is that the 5-day is a lot lower than, say, the 45-day. And the reason for that is because if you look back at the past 30 or 45 days, it was way above normal, right? The CDDs were way above normal. I think it was one of the warmest, 30-day or 45-day periods on record, top 2, 3. You can look at Radiant's Dynacast tool. The 5-day was not as warm, basis normal. In fact, you can see it down here. The verification, actually not here, but if you look at our most recent verification, you can see there was just a little bit above the 30-year. So anyway, that was a longer maybe explanation I expected, but does anyone have any questions about the one last and probably most important thing. I did, thanks to, I think, Matt Rogers and Philip, we identified a bug in the code and we updated that. It wasn't updated. It was basically verifying for HDDs instead of CDDs from the past few weeks. So that's obviously a problem. I believe that's fixed. And so if you look into the tables here under Sandbox, I'll just do it briefly. You can find the updated performance metrics. Does anyone have any questions about persistence before we get into attribution? Everyone's still there?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Sorry. Okay. Well, if anything comes to mind, we got another 40, 50 minutes here. So, all right. So for today's agenda, like mentioned, we'll start with attribution as we normally do, look at past week and the past couple months, and then we'll dive into the forecast process led by Matt Lanza. And then if we have any additional time, we can talk about some other research initiatives and things like that. Does anyone have any additional agenda items for today that they want to cover? Yeah. Okay. Well, if you think of something, you know where to find me. All right. So I'll kick this off, but again, folks should definitely feel free to jump in. We're going to just look at the weekly. We'll pull up Dynacast here in a second. We'll take a quick look at the past cooling season, and then we'll be off to the current forecast. All right. So this is the most recent verification. This is from 7/14th to July 14th, verifying from a couple days ago. The verification was 60.8 CDDs. The normal was, the 30-year normal was 56-ish, and the 10-year normal was 61.3. So it was straddled a little bit the 30 and the 10 year. So as I mentioned, it was still obviously warmer than the 30 year, but not as maybe as warm as some of the forecasts expected, mine included. So looking at the CRPS here in terms of the best forecast, we were led the way by the 5 year moving average, so a non-human forecast, but closely followed by Matt Rogers. Dr. Lupo also did very well, and the MJO analog, our sort of analog MJO forecast there, did pretty well. And then looking near the bottom, this is really not fair to Jack Stone. Jack's a new forecast from Delaware, and they were just getting they weren't yet calibrated. So I think you can kind of scratch that, give Jack a mulligan for that one. But you could see the CFS had a tough forecast too, as per normal, being on the cool side of things. And you could also see my forecast there too. Um, One of the things that I've adjusted, I put a lot of fudge factor in here, and you can kind of see it over here. My fudge factor forecasts, my subjective forecasts, were not working. In fact, if you take away, since I have the bully pulpit for the moment, I guess I'm talking about my own forecast. But if you take away my +7 fudge factor, I would have been at 61, and I would have almost had a perfect forecast minus for the sigma. So that's something that I'm going to talk about more in the current forecast. But all right, so that's the weekly. Let's pull up the Dynacast just so that we can see what the map looked like. Again, this is for July 29th to the 2nd, so I've already done that. But I'll pull up the map here. There's the map of verification. So you can see kind of we had this tripole kind of configuration, warm, cool in the middle, warm again on the East Coast, and definitely this kind of cool in the middle kind of ate up a little some of the CDDs. You know, so some important cities were included in this, including Chicago, Minneapolis, in particular, St. Louis, Kansas City. They definitely contribute to some of the CDDs. So that was definitely a limiting factor. I also want to pull up I think I have it here. Oh, someone's trying to join. Let someone in. I'm going to pull up we like to pull up the Maxar forecast, 16 to 28 forecast from them. So this is the wrong one. Let's see if I can get the right one. Yeah, this is the right one, right? Okay, so this is the Maxar energy report from July 14th and verifying for the same period here, July 29th, August 2nd. And I guess I'm just looking at this more from a pattern configuration standpoint. Well, let's focus on the EC. I would say I certainly wouldn't say this was an A+ kind of forecast in terms of configuration. We just talked about the fact that some of the coldest anomalies were Chicago, Minneapolis, down to St. Louis, Kansas City, and that's where the EC had some pretty warm anomalies. So from a pattern configuration standpoint, gosh knows if I was doing some station forecast, regional forecast, and not just national forecast, I would have some large errors here. So I think this was clearly a case of, and of course, even the Northeast here, the EC missed some of the significant heat anomalies, warm anomalies along the East Coast. So this would probably, if I'm trying to put my objective hat on, looking at this subjectively, of course, this would probably be on the lower end of the grading scale, I think. So this could be a case, as Steve Bennett likes to say, right for the wrong reasons kind of thing, like the EC forecast. Well, I guess it was too warm anyway, but certainly the configuration wasn't very good. So I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to pull up on Dynacast here. I am going to pull up the 500 millibar configuration. But as I do that, I want to open it up to more folks here in terms of thoughts or questions about this forecast. I screwed up, by the way. Let me. I just realized that I had 2019 up. This is 2020. So let's just Let's just look at this one more time. That's weird. I think I'm doing
Give
this
it set
right.
to minimum temperature, I think,
Oh,
Dave.
do I? Oh, sorry. Thank you. Thank you. Let's give that a shot. What was it? What's the default?
You had it on average temperature departure before, I think, but I think either that or cooling degree days probably work.
There we go. All right. So it's a little bit, it just looks like it's a little bit shifted over there. So I guess same ideas kind of apply, just a little bit shifted over there. But thanks for catching that. And Leah, let me pull up the hemispheric now. We'll try that one more time, just so folks
Actually,
can see it.
interestingly, with this map, it looks like the center of the cool is where the Euro had the center of the heat predicted.
Yeah. So I'll take away on the only caveat is lower end of the grading scale, perhaps the lowest end of the grading scale. Yeah, that was not from a pattern configuration. Gosh knows for folks who are making station-based forecasts across the United States, I think that would have caused a lot of problems. So, does anyone else have any thoughts about this forecast, the challenges or things that work well, or lessons learned?
I think this was when I started to put less of an impact with the CPC. What week was this? This was 20. This was 14. Okay. Let me just read real quick. Yeah, I was putting. I think I mentioned a couple. I guess it'd be a month ago now. Wow. I started using a new formula, and I was putting too much on the weight on the CPC without realizing it. So I ended up increasing my forecast by 2.5 CDDs based on the CPC forecast that particular week, and I think it was either that particular week or the week after that one where I realized that was too much for only a 20% weighting. And since then, I think I've only at most increased my forecast by like I think an eighth of a degree from the CPC. So that was just a hindsight 2020 on this one for me anyway.
Yeah.
One thing I thought was kind of interesting with respect to this forecast was how wet it was at the same time, which was kind of interesting. If you look at the precip departures as well during that time frame, obviously it co-locates pretty well with a good chunk of the cooler temps over the plains. And this is something I'm going to talk about a little bit as kind of a risk factor going into the current 16 to 20 that we're forecasting. I want to go through my forecast process, but I just kind of thought that was interesting. I'd be curious to see what the models had for precip for that time frame. I don't recall what the Euro weeklies had at that point in time for how much rainfall they were expecting. So I think kind of that and the obviously with the tropical system kind of being in there as a wild card too. Yeah, the interplay there is certainly I think interesting and added a little bit of complexity to both this current or this 16 to 20 day and the next one, the next period that we would be looking at.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a great point. We don't have the precipitation, but I guess the other thing that you guys kind of touched on, it's funny when we were talking about this forecast, and these forecasts from a few weeks ago. I mean, this is another case that it kind of, and you can see this by the persistence numbers, the long-term persistence numbers. It seemed like when I look at this pattern configuration in particular, like I wish I could see what it was forecast, the 500 millibar forecast, because I just don't think I had any expectation for this. I felt like this was a really low risk. It was like all those rules of thumb, like statistically, it was getting so. I felt like it was building the crescendo. I haven't followed the seasonal forecast as much as I'm sure Matt and others, but there's talk about heat building toward the end of summer because of La Nina and this and that. So it's like we're already hot. The other rule of thumb is like, July, August persistence, like, you kind of lock in July and August, blah, blah, blah. And here we are. Look at this pattern. I mean, if this were winter, I mean, geez, like classic, like P&A, like ridge trough pattern, and lit up. Yeah, I'm sure that helped with the precipitation, right? You had this amazingly hot, humid air mass in place and whatever, and then you put any kind of trough or weakness in the atmosphere, especially this one, and it just blew up precipitation across the eastern, 2/3 or at least eastern half or whatever of the country. So a combination of this trough and precipitation, and I could certainly see why my forecast blew up here. It was just not what I was expecting from a pattern configuration at all. Which brings up, and I guess it brings up a bigger, I guess where I'm going with this too is, these some of these rules of thumb about pattern persistence from July and August and stuff. What was this an MJO thing? I think I had the MJO up here earlier. I mean, or at least obviously this is the new forecast, but it just kind of made it, was this, I don't know, Philip's on the line too. I don't know, Philip, if you want to weigh in on this at all, but did we creep far enough into some of those cooler phases where that had an influence that maybe wasn't well resolved by the models, 20 days ago, 15 days ago? Anyone have any thoughts on that? Yes or no?
Hey, Dave.
Yeah.
You hear me? Dave D'Arcangelo here.
Hey, Dave.
I've been in and out on some of these the last, couple months. But I think from our perspective, this is going to be one of those weeks that gets kind of washed out in the broad, seasonal view of a very hot summer. So I'm not sure how much blame needs to get shared around when probably in hindsight, given that we look like the next 2, 3, 4 weeks, this one is just kind of one of those, it was a swing and a miss probably for a lot of folks. I know in the energy space, we had a lot of us that were, on the pretty hot side too. We're coming off the week prior to this, which was a very hot week. And, up until 12 hours ago, it stayed pretty hot in the East too. So, there's only, I think, so much blame that needs to go around. I look at this week as one of those chance weeks when in a broad seasonal signal, we had two things that happened. One is we had a little bit of a pause in the La Nina based state, and it was evident from we had a pretty good pulse, or we're in a pretty good pulse of positive AAM and also a negative SOI. And so it looks like those two are returning to their kind of summer-long base state, but this was a bit of a hiccup. Probably some good interference from both the Atlantic tropics. We had Douglas go north of Hawaii, and then there was a typhoon in the South China Sea. So maybe just the confluence of some tropical noise led us to kind of get this negative SOI and positive AAM bump. And in that bump, we saw some mid-latitude cooling pockmark what has been a pretty persistent seasonal signal. I would note, too, that this map that we showed, the verification for last week, or for the period ending, was it yesterday or Sunday? There actually had a lot of similarities to kind of some of the preseason, models, with regards to kind of this depiction of dual ridging that's over the Northeast or kind of off the U.S. Northeast coast, and then again in the Northwest. A lot of the preseason models going all the way back to March, I believe, kind of picked up on kind of if there was going to be a weakness anywhere in the country, it was going to be kind of in the central, western, Midwest plains. And then there were going to be competing ridges on each side of that. And that's actually what this week bore out. The seasonal signal, though, has been kind of anything but that. There really has been a lack of ridging in the Pacific Northwest. The ridging has been more kind of interior Southwest, arcing to the Great Lakes and Northeast. So it's funny to me when the pattern, quote unquote, breaks down for whatever, 5 days, a week, that it defaults towards where the preseason has it. Of course, that's going to get washed out here. And just some thoughts.
That's a good point, Dave. Too. It's the sort of the isle of cool in a sea of warmth kind of thing. Is this just, yeah, we're going to look back at this. That's a really good point, because you can see, I pulled up this screen, guys, because so you can see the fact that the forecast right now is the EC over in this column, and then Maxar. All these forecasts do show CDDs going back above and well above normal in some cases as we get into the 6, 10, 11 to 15. So this very well could be something like that. Does anyone? I know I'm looking at the time. Does anyone have any last thoughts about the summer or the past week before we shift over to the current forecast? Okay. So let's go to the forecast, and then yeah, Matt, if you're ready, what I'll do here is hand the screen over to you. And again, we welcome, if you're okay to share your screen, you're also welcome to share your video too. And that goes for everyone else too after Matt finishes his forecast discussion.
All right. Let me see if I can do this properly. I think it's the first time I've done this in Zoom. All right, can you all see that?
Yes.
Yep.
All right, perfect. Great, something actually worked. All right, so I'll just kind of run you through sort of the process. It's an evolving process. Every day is sort of just building off the previous day for what I'm doing for work purposes. So one of the first things I'm going to kind of focus in on is just 500 millibar heights. Just to kind of see, just to kind of just go over what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks. So you can see after we get through about this weekend, we start to see that change, as was just alluded to. And I completely agree with David about this being kind of a one-off sort of just a blurb in the middle of a sea of red, a dot of blue and a sea of red. Kind of situation right now. So, because if we go through the next couple of weeks, you can see we sort of return to this, ridging especially strong over Canada, or higher heights over Canada, with the 594 ridge over the southwest and into Texas. I think Texas remains sort of that big wild card. Texas has been weird this year, and then, we've had heat, and then it looks like, we're going into drought, it's going to be hot forever, and then all of a sudden we have something that spoils it in terms of like either an upper low or a tropical system, tropical wave. Something comes along to just kind of spoil the heat, so we don't get more than a week or two of really hot weather, and then it's kind of, okay, now what? And it feels sort of like Texas is heading back into one of those again as we go through this weekend and into next week. So, once we get to day 15, I mean, if you just look at the pure, European ensemble mean, it's sort of kind of what we've seen most of summer. At least that's what I feel like, where, your heights are highest again up in the Northeast and across the Great Lakes, and then at times in the plains, and then back to the Southwest, where the back Northwest ends up kind of, left out of all this. So, your wild card remains really, I think, Texas. Your stronger heat is probably going to be New England into the lakes relative to average. And, so that's sort of our starting point, I think, as we go into the 16 to 20 day. Here's your 11 to 15 day map for 2 meter temps. Here's your 11 to 15 day map for precip, hot and dry kind of the deal. So that's one of the things I wanted to talk about. And that's one of the things I wanted to highlight, because it's one of the things I've been highlighting at work lately. That I think is kind of interesting is if you look at biases, and so this is through one of our other vendors that we use, Storm Vista, that has a bias map, 30-day bias from the European ensemble, 11 to 15 day. So this is just 11 to 15, but I think it applies to 16 to 20 in this case as well. You can kind of see how biased it's been across the Central Plains and across parts of the Midwest. It's been running way too hot. And I think we all know that the models, if we've been dealing with the 15-day forecast, we know the models have generally been running a little too hot. They've been directionally pretty good, but they've just been overstating how hot it was going to be. I think one of the interesting things to look at is the precip bias, which kind of co-locates over where it's biased to the hot side, is also biased to the dry side as well. So there's been more precip, and I've talked to some folks that deal with like ag traders and ag forecasting, and they've been throwing fits all summer because the precip forecasts, even within 2 or 3 days of an event, have been terrible across a lot of the corn belt. So, it's been kind of interesting to watch this, model bias too dry, and then all of a sudden we get thunderstorms that spoil the heat kind of deal. So I think that sort of alludes to the strongest risk, in my opinion, for going forward in time, is just that, we're going to end up coming in a little bit wetter and not quite as hot as what maybe, was what had been previously forecast, or what seemed to be the case in the modeling. So that's one of the things that I'm kind of keeping in my back pocket as a real risk to the forecast going forward. So, one of the other things that David also touched on was watching this AAM anomaly sort of drop off. This is again, European ensemble in the red lines. We go from this peak, later this weekend, we peak positively, and then we start to slope back negative. And this has been showing up for kind of several days now, that it was going to kind of drift back toward a neutral or negative side of things. And again, just I pulled up the Dynacast here, the teleconnection data for August, at least. If I could do this my way, I would do August 15th to September 15th. But just for the month of August and the month as a whole, your 10 most positive AMs obviously go a little bit cooler than normal, whereas that changes on the lowest side. And then their favorite analogs, I forget how Maxar does this, produces this, but whatever the case, their favorite analogs look kind of pretty good, in my opinion, from a forecast standpoint, just as is. But as we go back toward a negative angular momentum, I think that sort of, it facilitates a better background state for a hotter forecast, which is why I'm not really that worried that this week really means that much in terms of the grand scheme of things for summer. So that, that's one thing I think to kind of keep in mind. The other thing is I don't have any charts up here for MJO stuff, but just looking at where the convection is going to be over in the Indian Ocean, and on that side, it sort of co-locates closer to going back toward almost like a phase 2 sort of situation, which is also hotter. From an MJO standpoint, it tends to be a little bit hotter in the U.S. So one of the other things I do is I sort of combine all these factors, where the teleconnections, the key teleconnections that I think are going to be, and I make a composite map based on this. I use either an Excel file that I have, or I use commodity weather, and it's just easier to just kind of show you commodity weather group image that I put together. This is what I'm getting today, from including things like GLAM, the EPO, the WPO. Just kind of where they're expected to be around day 15, and sort of extrapolating that forward into what that could mean for the 16 to 20. Again, it shows, your strongest positive temp anomalies over the Great Lakes, Midwest, Northeast. Probably much too cool in the West, but you get the idea. It's sort of hinting more than anything, I think. And one of the things I think is interesting, if you just look at June 1 to July 31, I mean, this is what we've done in terms of temp anomalies. And I'm a big believer in that. Once you get stuck in one of these summer patterns, they do tend to be pretty persistent at times. And if we're going to use persistence as part of the forecast process here, then yeah, above normal across the lakes in the Northeast and Ontario and Quebec, and then your wild card remains the plains. It's been hotter than normal here. Really, the risk is precip again. If we have more thunderstorms than expected on the periphery of the ridge, or some type of rogue front that gets through something, shortwave trough that can fire up thunderstorms, and obviously won't be this hot, but it'll be warm. So I think just in looking at all this and putting it all together, I think it's pretty safe to say that you're going to go above the 10-year normal at this point. In a world where you were just trusting the models completely, you would probably go well above the 10-year normal, which right now is what? It's about 52. So, you're looking at like 60 plus. So, I'm only going 56 right now, which is about 100, I think it's 107% above the 10-year. Because I have some concerns about precip, that might be missed across the central U.S. I also have concerns about the tropics, in particular the Gulf. If you look at some of the velocity potential plots, it looks as though things are going to start to heat up here As we go close to that 16 to 20 period, I think the next 10 days or so are going to be pretty quiet. But getting beyond that, I think your risk of something going wrong increases pretty dramatically. Going into the last 10 days or so of August. So any risk that you could wipe Texas demand out, pretty considerably, have much fewer CDDs in Texas would not be good. Much fewer CDDs in the Southeast would not be good. Granted, those have been places that have not been racking up CDDs relative to average pretty, considerably this summer. But if you do throw that into the mix, even if it is a few degrees above normal from Chicago to Boston, I'm sort of playing all right, we'll go a little bit above the 10-year normal, but maybe not as high as I would go normally kind of card. So I think just kind of putting it all together, it seems pretty straightforward to me, as straightforward as a 16 to 20-day forecast can be. I favor hot, but not too hot. And that's kind of how I've been framing it at work. It's been one of the things that's been kind of tough to frame to both traders and people that are analyzing demand is, it's been very hot this summer, but has it been extreme? It's been extreme at times and in places, but, where have the extremes really been? Have they been in the big cities, pretty consistently? I mean, there was a point in time where I would have been willing to say that Chicago had a chance to get into the upper 90s to near 100. And I think they only hit it a couple times in the upper 90s. I don't even think they got to above 98 or 97 was their hottest temp. But I thought if we were going to have a chance to get to 100 degrees in Chicago, this was going to be it. And we've managed to avoid that. I think we've had, a couple of stronger heat events in the East, but they've only lasted a couple of days. I think the DC streak, where they had all those 90-degree days in a row, there were only a handful of days that were above like 93 or 94, which is still hot for sure. And it does create, consistent demand. But I think trying to frame that has been very difficult this summer. Reminds me a little bit of, I think it was 16 or 17 that summer, where we had a lot of the heat that was driven, especially by nighttime lows being so, you had higher CDDs, but it was all off-peak type heat. So that's been a little bit challenging. But, for the most part, I think it seems, fairly straightforward. And hopefully that gives you a little better insight into kind of how I forecast.
You want to have questions for Matt? Matt, I have one question. I guess it's for you and Dave, or it could be for both you guys. But how do you like how do you distinguish what are the characteristics you might look for? Like let's say you're expecting a hot summer, and it's been mostly hot, and you expect at some points you'll get some breaks, like just what happened, some cooler, less hot periods, whatever. um, how do you distinguish between those situations where it actually looks like it could turn into something that is more persistent, versus, yep, this is just that small break of heat? Are there, you know what I mean? How do you handle situations? I'm sure there's been situations where it's responded exactly as expected. Warm, a little bit of cool, and then back warm. But perhaps you've witnessed other situations where you expected the warm, cool, warm, but it never happened, and it kind of went warm, cool-ish going forward. What can you can you separate out those kind of characteristics, those signals between what is more likely to be a prolonged period of cool versus something that is just a short, brief glimpse or brief period?
I think for me, I'll just kind of start. One of the things I think in this situation that was kind of interesting was I definitely struggled for a little bit. It was sort of felt like we were teetering for a couple of days where, okay, maybe this has a chance to go to something a little bit more prolonged than just a few days leading up to early August. Some of that I think was driven by MJO signals, which were starting to try and move around into phases that maybe were a little more variable. I don't want to say they were cool, but they were a little more variable. And when you see variability, you start to see, okay, there's definitely going to be cooler risks. But I think one of the things that was kind of interesting was looking at the the tendency of the AAM, angular momentum, and seeing how quickly it shifted to a negative tendency sort of made me think that, okay, this feels a little bit to me like a blip more than something that's going to be permanent, and that, the background state's going to be supportive of heat as we get into, past whatever this is. I think the bigger concern for me was tropics. Was there going to be, more action in the Atlantic than maybe had been showing up in time? So I think that's one of the things to look at. If you have confidence in, tropics being a little bit of a headache, that can maybe increase your confidence that the overall pattern may not be as hot as otherwise expected, in this sort of transitional situation. And I think having sort of a grasp on the MJO helps too. There's some days I hate using the MJO because it can be so frustrating dealing with, sometimes the Wheeler diagrams don't necessarily work well because of, where convection is. And I feel like this was a situation almost where it looked like we had a wave that was trying to propagate forward a little bit more across, north of Australia. And it just sort of stopped and has gone to this more of a standing wave type thing in the Western Indian Ocean, which is a little bit more supportive, I think, of hotter weather. By no means am I an expert on MJO, but like I know enough to kind of understand, when to use it and when not to use it. And so I think you have to know in that situation when that's going to be really effective, because I think that's going to be a really good sign that there might be a little bit more of a substantial change than something that was a blip on the radar. It was close on a couple of days with this one, but it just never really got to the point where I was really worried about August completely failing and face planting. My CDD outlook for August, I think I had it up around 355, and I cut it to 350 was as far as I went, which is still above the 10-year normal for the month. So it just never got panicky on it. So I think you just have to look at all the signals combined and just, ask yourself, what is the background state going to change fundamentally that is not going to be supportive of heat? And the answer in this case was no, it doesn't look that way. Yes, it did temporarily, but it looked like it was trending back pretty quickly. And if the background state's really going to change, then to me, that's going to argue, okay, we're going to have to be on alert here for something a little bit more extreme.
Got it. Thank you. Hey, Matt, would you mind? You don't have the forecast contest up, do you? Chance somewhere.
I don't, but I can get it up.
I was just, if you have a sec, the reason I was going to see what some of the other forecasts were before we turn it over to one of the students, just to see, let's see, if you don't mind sorting by the mean. Okay, thank you. So this is today's, right? So just saying if anyone had any kind of cool forecasts. It's the coolest forecast maybe thought. So I guess, but yeah, no, this is really good. We have I think 10 or 15 minutes left. So if one of our participants would like to go, and again, whether it's Philip, Zach, or Michael, or whoever, I'd suggest anyway. You don't have to do this, but share your screen. And why don't we kick it off that, we'll put Matt now in the client seat. So you're talking to Matt as the client. Matt only has 2 or 3 minutes, so you have to be pithy, right? And then Matt will ask you, definitely feel free to challenge and ask hard questions and things like that. And we could just kind of go through that process and for the next few minutes. Who would like to volunteer?
I'll volunteer.
I'll stop sharing my screen. So.
Okay. All right. Thanks, man.
All right, I'll share mine. Figure out which one. Okay, that looks like. Okay, everyone can see it.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Just have to find me. Okay, so my forecast was for 57.1 CDDs with an average spread of 6.8, normal confidence. So I started off with a base forecast of 55.8, and the way I get that is take 30% of the Euro forecast and add it with 70% of the 10-year normal, and that gets me to 55.8. 0.8. So then I took a look at the teleconnections. Noticed that the only couple of differences that we've seen for most of the summer is the NAO is actually a little positive this week. Forecast to continue positive, although looks kind of disconnected a little bit here, but we'll see how that continues. But it looks to head back towards negative towards the verification period. So treated that as a neutral to slightly negative signal. AO looks to be around neutral. Didn't really affect my forecasts at all. It's middle of summer. Don't really think this has much of an influence unless there's a strong signal. P&A kind of jagged forecast here, but looks to overall be positive. Has been verifying positive, very positive on the past few weeks side of this forecast. So again, another positive. So warm signal there. Last teleconnections, EPO. I haven't looked at this verification in the past couple of weeks, but hasn't been verifying very well from what I've seen. But this is pretty strong positive signal and decently strong positive signal towards the end around where we'd wanted for the verification period. So took that as a weekly positive signal. Again, another warm signal. That, and then lastly, we've got the CPC forecast, a lot of warmth, 70% above average in the southwest. If I'm reading this right, 60% over most of the East Coast. Little chance of, only equal chance in central portions, a little southern Gulf Coast area. So I only, as I mentioned earlier, I've been adding too many CDDs with this, so I only added in, just kind of finishing here, 0.5 CDDs based on the above normal in the CPC and only 0.8 from the teleconnections because I was not too impressed with the NAO signal or the EPO signal. So that's my forecast. Any complaints, comments, questions, concerns?
What I'll just ask you. So you showed NAO, AO, EPO, sort of PNA. Which do you think correlates best this time of year?
So I think it looks, at least this particular year, I don't know really for the last year because I wasn't using this at that time, but for this year it seems to be the P&A seems to be the best correlator since it's been the most consistently positive other than a few dips. I think it looks like mid-June and mid-July around the same area. NAO I don't think has had as great of an influence overall, at least not this year. So I think the P&A has had from a teleconnection standpoint. That's not to say that I think it's had the greatest influence on the pattern. Period. I think of the teleconnections, I think the P&A has had the strongest influence.
Thanks.
Okay. We'll keep things moving along. Unless there's any other questions for Michael, who would like to go next?
I guess I will go next.
And Philip, if you don't mind, again, if you can, share your screen.
All right.
And I would suggest, again, make this really, let's put Matt again on the spot. If Matt's okay being the focal here. But I would, like you're talking about, like pretend you just picked up the phone. Hey, Matt, how are you? You ready for your briefing? Like, I think if you make it more personal, it focuses you in terms of making sure you're providing the best content. And also another suggestion, maybe start with the takeaways. What do you think are the takeaways, the most important things that Matt should know about today's forecast? All right.
Okay.
Over to you.
Sure. Before I start, I'll just comment that the floodgates just got unleashed here and suddenly looks interesting outside, but I will continue. So hello, Matt. So today here is our forecast. The main takeaways is that we are slightly warmer than the 10-year normal, and our confidence is pretty close to average. And here is my weighting scheme that I use. So I will go into a bit of detail. So for tropics, we note that tropical convection is active in the northern Indian Ocean, and we see a bit of convection in Africa, and that puts the MJO signal in phase 4. And using my lag composites, using my lag composites for phase H, July, August, September, that turns out to be a slightly warm signal for this time, which agrees with our MJO analog, which is at 49.4, slightly above the 30-year. And then the ENSO conditions, they're trending towards a La Nina, which based on this is if I can click that, is also a slightly warm signal for this time of year. So my tropics was a warm signal. And then the CPC, as was already mentioned, puts a warmth in the southwest and the east with an equal chance limited to Louisiana and Missouri. So this was also a warm signal. The teleconnections, as Mike mentioned, are currently in positive, with the NAO and EPO forecasted shift from positive maybe to neutral or slightly negative. And the AO and PNA are also forecast to move to around neutral, but the signal was not very clear. But overall, with the NAO being slightly negative, I treated that as a slightly warm signal for this time. And then for the dynamical models, I note that the EC continues to forecast strong ridging over the northern CONUS and Canada, and the CFS is actually similar with weaker anomalies. So actually, pattern-wise, both the EC and the CFS are not that different, but the EC ends up being a lot warmer than the CFS. And given a concern for tropical activity in the end of the month, I did not increase my confidence too much. So my sigma is still close to the 30-year average.
All right. That's good. I'm trying to think if there's one thing I was going to ask you. What's your reasoning for thinking about increased tropical activity at the end of the month?
I know I was looking at some of the models, and I didn't look in too much detail, but I noticed that there's a lot of suggestion of waves coming off Africa, and that could mean an increase in tropical activity, mainly in the Atlantic, maybe not so much in the Pacific.
All right, very good. Trying to think, sometimes it's hard for me to think. Yeah, I have to I have to think like a trader here, which is easier said than done sometimes, in terms of what to ask, especially when you kind of understand where everything is coming from. No, it's good.
Any other questions for Philip from the rest of the crew here? I guess if I was nitpicky, trying to be nitpicky too, that last comment, something about it I keep coming back to it. Despite most variables showing warmth, confidence was only treated slightly above average due to concern from tropical activity in the end of the month. I guess what bothers me about that a little bit is, how do you qualify that? Isn't there this time of year, August, September, isn't there almost always some degree of tropical activity? So what does that imply? That if there was literally almost zero tropical activity, you would have high confidence? And if there was a lot of storms all over the place, that you have low confidence? Is that how you look at confidence in terms of with respect to the 16-20-day forecast? It's heavily modulated by tropical activity in the Atlantic and Pacific Basin?
That's the way I've been interpreting it. I don't know if that is correct or not, but based on my understanding of how the tropical cyclones can sometimes change the pattern, or even just in terms of a more localized thing where you have a storm and it lowers the overall temperature for the day.
By the way, I think that brings up a possibly an interesting research exercise, right? and maybe Matt can shed some light on this, but we could get a hold of like all tropical whatever activity and kind of test this theory, right? Or look at historical tropical activity in the last 50 years, and or maybe not 50 years, but and look at that in relation to I guess forecast error. So either contemporaneous or forecast. So if contemporaneously, the hypothesis is, we subset into active, normal, maybe just three buckets to start with, normal, active, and non-active, and look at forecast skill. We could look at CDDs in the summer as a function of that in the 16 and 20. And do we see a relationship there? Because that is, at least in part, is that fair, Philip, that is in part what your sort of rule of thumb is, what your kind of thinking is?
Yeah.
Matt, do you have any thoughts about that, either setting up that exercise or just your thoughts in terms of what the analysis would show? Do you think it would show a pretty good relationship?
It's tough to say. From my vantage point, to me, it becomes, at least initially, unless you're just gonna have a barrage of storms that are following like sort of the same path. To me, initially, it becomes more of a localized issue than any sort of like big picture pattern change type thing. I think if you want to look at it from, okay, does it have anything beyond a localized issue? I think you could possibly do that with looking at the Atlantic side. I think that would be an interesting thing. I think you would probably have to use something like ACE in a month, or like with some sort of lag built in. I would also probably think that you would want to look at like the West Pacific as well. Look at typhoons out there, because it seems to be that whether it's the typhoon that itself that's causing the issue, or it's the pattern that causes the typhoon to do a certain thing that's the bigger issue. I think that's an interesting area to look at. It's an area that I wish I had more time to look at and research, because you hear about it all the time. Everybody's like, oh, there's a recurving typhoon in the Pacific, especially as we get into October, November, and get into heating season. Everybody gets all jacked up whenever there's a recurving typhoon. And I think that there's probably some merit to looking at that in summer too. I think this year's kind of interesting, because I think the accumulated cyclone energy in the West Pacific is like 15% of normal right now. So it's been short of recently, it's been pretty dead over there. So I think it's a good case to argue, like to me, that sort of argues that, okay, well, maybe we want to keep this sort of persistent idea of a pattern in place. Whereas if you saw more activity, maybe you're thinking, okay, there's more variability risk that's kind of injected into this because of the amount of tropical activity. And I think the same would be said for the Atlantic too, that, we've had a pretty active Atlantic this year, but we've had mostly a lot of little storms, other than the last two, I think. But I think it's something interesting to look at, and I don't know what you would find, really, to be honest with you. I think you might see some signal. Like I said, the more storms, I think you would have more variability, but it's a good question.
Yeah, that's interesting. And if we did this, we could certainly, as Matt brings up a good point about, we could subset by basin, right? If there's all these HERDAT type data sets out there, so we could look at it sort of hemispherically or globally, but we can also subset by the Pacific, Atlantic, and stuff like that. And also, one other thing you said gave me an idea. We could look at it certainly in terms of forecast performance, which I think would be interesting and important. But we could also look at it in terms of pattern stability, right? I think that's sort of also something that comes up a lot, something that came up even today. In other words, if there's low tropical activity, does that suggest that more pattern stability in the summer, late summer, or not? I guess my rule of thumb, my just off the cuff, would be like, hey, if you have more tropical activity, you have more risks for the patterns to reconfigure, change, blah blah blah. But I don't know. I don't know if that's 100% true or not. So, but anyway, it's something. I know we're out of time, so I apologize to a couple of folks who didn't get a chance. We'll make sure those guys get a chance next time. But I know there's also some research guys on the phone here with Sean, Zach, Philip, and stuff like that. So this is definitely something that maybe we can we can think about. And if anyone does have any interest in looking into this, again, we already have the forecast metrics thanks to Maxar, and it would just take a little bit of work, data mining, to get some of that hurricane data, acquired that's out there and sort of processed and whatnot. So something to think about. But with that, Matt, want to thank you for a really good discussion. Thanks for participating in our sort of back and forth there, too, playing the role of client and such like that. And hopefully we can have you back again soon here.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thanks for having me. Everything's great. It's always enjoyable to be on this.
Great. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. We'll see you again next week.
Thanks. Bye.
I guess.
Take care.
Thank you.